right, here we are. Here we are. Well, sorry for the technical difficulties, but we're back. We're ready to go. In the chat, or sorry, in the Q&A section, please confirm that you can see me, you can hear me, you can see the screen with the LSATMax logo and everything, and then we can get started. In the meantime, I'll look through when we're taking the LSAT. So looks like got a couple of August, we got a couple of Junes, we got some Aprils. Oh, more Junes and Aprils than I expected. For sure. Some people debating between August and September. Sounds like a lot of us are up in the air now. Some of us waiting for the logic games to be banished, in John's words. I like that. What I'd like to hear in these is that we don't know. A lot of us are still wondering whether we should take the LSAT before the logic games go away or after the logic games go away. And if that applies to you, you are definitely in the right place because that is the subject of today's webinar. I'll be discussing that in depth. I'll also be discussing some tips for how to study for the LSAT and some tools you can use for studying for the LSAT if you are taking the exam with logic games. So that would be April or June, or without logic games in August or later. So we have a lot to discuss today. So we'll jump right in. So the topic, as I've stated, as I've alluded to before, is that there's really two versions of the LSAT that are existing this year. There's version number one. This is the LSAT that's existed since 2021 with three scored sections. As we can see, there's a logical reasoning section, a reading comprehension section, and a notorious little number called the logic game section that makes a lot of people nervous, that upsets a lot of people, but also makes some people happy, helps some people's scores. Second version of the LSAT is going to be coming later this year. And in this version, they're taking that logic game section away and they're replacing it with a second logical reasoning section. So your three scored sections on that exam will be two logical reasoning sections plus one reading comp section. Now, both versions of these LSATs will have a fourth unscored section that's known as the experimental section. In LSAT version one, that can be a second logical reasoning, logic games, or reading comprehension section. And in LSAT version number two, the experimental section can only be taken as a logical reasoning or reading comp section. And as we said, version number one is pre-August 2024. So that leaves us with the April and June exams as the last two. And version number two is going to switch over to this new format in August 2024. So we're all looking forward to that. And what we're going to talk about today is what to do with that information, how we can plan our study journey now that we know that logic games is going away in August 2024. That's what I'm going to talk about. My name, by the way, is Ross. I'm the director of content and head of instruction at LSATMax. Quick, brief bio on me. I've been working in the LSAT prep space for over 10 years now. I've worked at a variety of companies doing a variety of things, pretty much everything you can do. And I've been with LSATMax since 2021. Been real proud to be part of LSATMax because I really believe that LSATMax offers the most comprehensive, understandable resources at the best price in this space. And that's an important thing to me. And that's an important thing to Maran, who started this company. And so I've been a real proud worker here at LSATMax since 2021. Most of the work I do behind the scenes, managing our very talented team of instructors, making resources for our many students. Don't come out to these webinars that often, at least I don't host these webinars very often. But, since the LSAT is making a major change, I decided, yeah, I'd like to host this one. I'm really happy to be here with y'all and excited to teach you a little bit about the changing version of the test. So let's dive in, shall we? Now, as far as I know, the chat section is still disabled. Don't know what's going on there. Haven't gotten any updates, but we'll continue to comment with each other in the Q&A section. So if you have any questions for me that you would like answered like in the moment right now, please let me know in the Q&A section, but let me know it's like about something I'm discussing live, like you can write like urgent in all caps, and I'll know that's something I should address now. Otherwise, if it's a question that's a little bit more generalized, maybe it's a little bit not something about not a question about what I'm talking about in the moment, you can just leave it there and I'll get to it at the end of today's webinar. So if you want it answered live, you can put it in the Q&A section. Just write urgent or something like that. But if you're okay with waiting until the last portion of this webinar, we'll have an open Q&A. You don't need to put that urgent notification. So a little bit about what this webinar is going to look like today. I have it organized around 3 questions. First question, why? Why is logic games going away? Give a brief discussion of the reason why that logic games section will be going away in August 2021. Excuse me, August 2024. Then second question, which should you take? Should you take the version of the test with games or without games? And we'll discuss a variety of factors that can influence your decision on which LSAT you should take. Seems germane to a lot of you because a lot of you seem like you're up in the air with that decision. So we'll discuss that. That'll kind of comprise the bulk of today's webinar. Last question is how? How should we study once we've decided which LSAT we're going to take? So I'm going to give you some really important tips that I've culled from my 10 plus years of experience on how to ace the logic game section. And then we're going to discuss some tools to study for the test without logic games. So those are going to be the 3 questions around which this webinar is organized. So those are the questions I will be asking and answering. But then at the end, give you a chance for you to ask me questions that you have about the LSAT or law school admissions. We're going to have kind of an open Q&A at the end of today's session, at which point I'll answer any and all of the questions you have in the Q&A section. Now, budgeting time. I think we're gonna be able to get through the first 3 parts of this, the why, which, and how, in about an hour, maybe a little bit less, depending on how many questions we get. And at the end, I'll stay for as long as I need to answer your questions. So that's how this thing is going to progress. Does that sound good? We ready? We ready to jump in? All right. Well, without any different contrary arguments, why don't we start with why? Why are logic games going away? Well, it's kind of a boring answer, maybe not so boring if you're really interested in disability law, but the reason is that logic games are being removed as part of a legal agreement with test takers who are blind or visually impaired. A few years ago, a few test takers who are either blind or visually impaired sued LSAC, the organization that writes the LSAT, administers the LSAT, and deals with law schools admissions, arguing that the logic games section was unfair to them, even with LSAC's granted testing accommodations to these test takers. And I think a lot of us felt like, yeah, those people have a good point. Like, what logic games are is that they present a fictional scenario with a set of variables and the slots that those variables can be placed in. These things tend to have kind of a visual element to them. Situations like we're ordering horses in a race. What order do those horses finish in the race? Or taking a set of different people and we're sorting them into 3 different groups. Now, these definitely have a visual element to them because you kind of have to imagine the order that those horses finish that race or how those people are getting stuffed into those 3 groups. And that's something that we can actually keep track of quite well with scratch paper. Because what the logic games are going to do is after they give us that fictional scenario, they're going to provide a set of rules that govern how those variables can be ordered or grouped. And these rules can get a little complex. They can intersect with each other and combine with each other to create new additional rules that we call deductions. We kind of need to figure out how those rules connect and how those rules actually limit the number of ways that those variables can be ordered or grouped. Because that's what the questions are ultimately going to ask about. They're going to ask about what order the horses can finish their race in, which horses can finish next to each other, which horses cannot finish next to each other. Oh, if this horse finishes second, where does this horse finish? Or they're going to ask about how those people can be grouped, who can go to with each other in the same group, who can't go with each other in the same group. If this person goes into group 2, who has to go into group 3? And this is something that we can keep track with our scratch paper. When you take the test, you're allowed to have sheets of scratch paper with you. And this is something that you want to diagram on that scratch paper. You want to kind of diagram little slots that the horses can finish in so you can keep track of who's finishing where. You want to write out your variables and the groups that they can be put into. And for reasons that are probably so obvious they don't need to be stated, people who are blind or visually impaired do not find that scratch paper quite as useful as the rest of us. So they sued LSAC, arguing that the accommodations that they were given were not adequate. LSAC promised to research viable alternatives to the logic game section and ultimately decided that they would remove that section. We can debate on whether that was the best way to address, again, what we believe are very legitimate concerns of test takers who are blind or visually impaired, but that's not the point of today's webinar. The point of today's webinar is to talk about what's going to happen now that the logic games are going away and, again, being replaced with a logical reasoning section, a second logical reasoning section, which is going to ask test takers to analyze the structure and reasoning of short arguments. And this section is decidedly less visual in nature and does, in many ways, level the playing field for all test takers. And again, that logical reasoning section is going to be implemented in the August 2024 exam. Now that we know why it's going away, we're going to talk about which LSAT we're going to take. Which LSAT is the right LSAT for you? Should you take the LSAT with logic games or without logic games? So, first thing we need to consider is timing. Now, what I want to get out of the way first, if you want to begin law school in 2024, and you want to start law school in August of 2024, you will be taking the version of the LSAT with the logic game section. And that's because we are well underway application season to begin law school in 2024. In fact, some schools have already all schools have already had their deadline to submit applications. Now, most law schools keep their deadlines open through March, some of which extended through April, May, June even, but those are kind of pushing it. In order to get into law school this year, to start in August, we'll need to take the April or June 2024 LSAT. So if you're dead set on beginning law school in 2024, you're taking the April or June LSAT. Even June is kind of pushing it. April is even pushing it for some schools, but that's the first thing that we need to get out of the way. So if anyone here beginning law school in 2024, we will plan on taking the LSAT in April or June of 2024. And if that applies to you, if you need to take the LSAT to begin law school in 2024, reach out to us. We have student advisors who can help you devise an LSAT crash course specified to your individual needs. And our law school admissions consultants can help you prepare your applications while you study. Because these next months are going to be pretty intensive for you as you prepare to take the April or June LSAT and get your application materials ready, if necessary, so that you can begin law school in August. So that's the first thing you need to address. If you want to begin law school this year, you're taking the LSAT with logic games. On the other hand, if you are considering taking or beginning law school in 2025 or later, you have some flexibility. You can choose which type of LSAT to take. And this is a really great thing because it gives you, for really the first time in the history of the LSAT, a little bit of strategy on deciding what LSAT is right for you. So let's talk about how we can strategize which LSAT is the right one for us. So the first thing I want to talk about is reasons to take the LSAT before August 2024. So there are a few, in my opinions, really good reasons why you should aim to take the LSAT in April or June 2024. And again, to discuss these reasons, let's talk about what logic games are again. They're little hypothetical situations, ordering horses, assigning people to three different groups, maybe like three different booths at a fair or something like that. But really, and yeah, we can visualize them on our scratch paper, but they're not testing you on logic games because law schools care about your ability to order horses or assign people to booths at a fair. There's something behind these logic games, skills that these logic games are really testing. And those skills are what I'm going to call spatial and conditional reasoning skills. I know that sounds kind of like airy, highfalutin, maybe doesn't mean a lot of things. So I'll just give a little bit of examples what I mean by spatial and conditional reasoning skills. Spatial skills are tested more often in those kind of ordering type games. We call them linear games at LSATMax. For instance, let's say we had three horses, G, J, and M. We're going in spots 3, 2, and 5, respectively. We also had a rule that told us that horse H has to finish 3 spots ahead of horse T. That means they're kind of going to fill a little box like the one we have here. It's going to be H, and there's going to be 2 other horses who finish, and then there's going to be T. So with spatial reasoning, we have to kind of look at this game board that we've constructed on our scratch paper and ask ourselves, okay, where is there space to put that HT kind of block that we're playing with? As you can probably see, there's only 2 places that we can fit this HT block in our setup. We can put H in 1 and T in 4, so J and G are going between them. Or we can move H down to 4 and T down to 7, with M and some other horses going in between them. And those are the only 2 spaces that we could fit that HT block. This is kind of a simplified version of what will happen on real logic games, but it's not simplified that much. A lot of these ordering games especially are about thinking about spaces where your variables can go. Do we have enough space for these variables given where the other variables have to go and how this variable affects other variables? On the other hand, we have conditional reasoning skills, which get tested more extensively in the kind of grouping style games we have on the right. Now, a rule in this game might say something like, if A is assigned to the group, then we cannot assign B in the group, which we have represented there as A arrow, no B. If A is in the group, then that's what that arrow means. Can't have any B. And so that just means like, oh, if we know that A is going in group 1, that means that B can't go there. B will have to go in group 2 or 3. Again, this is kind of a simplified version of what a real logic games would do, but this is kind of the basis of what they're testing. Spatial reasoning skills and conditional reasoning skills. Now, with that said, this type of reasoning, or these 2 types of reasoning, I should say, come a little bit easier to some people. There's certain academic backgrounds that really heavily test this kind of skill. For instance, engineers are kind of the classic learn spatial reasoning major. So if you're an engineer, maybe logic games are going to kind of come a little bit more easily to you. Computer scientists engage in a lot of conditional reasoning skills in their coding. So grouping games especially might come a little bit easier to them. Mathematics deals with a lot of conditional reasoning skills as well. So math whizzes might find logic games to come a little bit easier to them. And by the way, this is not a comprehensive list at all. There's other disciplines to whom these reasoning skills might come a little bit easier. For instance, I have a friend who, before she became a lawyer and LSAT teacher, she was going to dental school. And I guess the dentists have to have really good spatial reasoning skill because you're sticking implements into people's mouths and having to look at like mirrors to kind of see their teeth and stuff. So the DCAT, I believe it's called, the dental entry exam, really tests that spatial reasoning. So maybe if you were thinking about becoming a dentist at some point, logic games would come a little bit easier to you as they did to her. So these are people to whom they kind of have the skills of logic games in their training. So if you have these backgrounds, if you have a STEM background like these people, you might be able to outperform other test takers on the logical reasoning section. In fact, if you actually look at the people who do the best on the LSAT, what majors they studied in college, people with STEM majors traditionally outperform other test takers. A lot of people, come to the LSAT having taken poli-sci or sociology or history or English, and they do all right on the test, but a lot of STEM majors end up doing better. And my theory is logic games plays a very big role. So if you have this STEM background and you want to maintain your competitive edge, you might want to think about taking the LSAT before August 2024. But even if you don't have that educational background, there are other ways to acquire these skills. Hang on one sec. Just had a frozen screen for a moment. Get it back up. So there are other ways to acquire these skills outside of your work or the classroom. A lot of these skills are tested through puzzle-based games, games like chess or Sudoku or Tetris or Portal, which I'm told is a thing. Uh, Minecraft, probably many more examples that I'm frankly too old and out of touch to know. But if you're into these kinds of games, you are actually acquiring some of the skills that are going to be applicable to the logic game section. So if you're interested in these games, you may have already developed strong spatial and conditional reasoning skills. So if you take the LSAT with logic games, that LSAT may play to your strengths as a test taker, may give you a slight competitive edge on that test. So again, another reason to take the LSAT with logic games. Another reason to take the LSAT with logic games is that high scores are more likely to ace the logic game section. Now, I've been doing this for over 10 years, met a lot of students, met a lot of instructors who have scored the top scores on the LSAT. And by far the most likely pathway to a top score on the LSAT is by acing that logic game section. That logic game section tends to be the easiest, by no means easy, but relative to the other sections, the easiest section to consistently get a perfect score on. And a perfect or even near perfect logic game score can make up for questions you either get wrong or strategically skip in the other two sections, in the reading comp and logical reasoning sections. It's a lot easier to earn your top score when the only questions you're going to miss are on logical reasoning and reading comprehension. So essentially, when you have this logic game section where a lot of people can get to the point where they're consistently acing it, they're subsidizing their other two sections with that strong logic game score. It's like becomes the foundation that they can build the rest of their score out of. To just give you a sense of what that looks like, you can see in this chart right here how the LSAT is scored. So on the left, we have the scaled scores, the numbers we all talk about when we talk about how what LSAT score we got. It's a number between 120 and 180, 180 being the highest score. And let's say that your target score on the LSAT, the score you wanted to get, was a 170. Well, that means out of the 75 questions on that test, you need to get 66 of them correct. Now, if you get a perfect logic game score, you're starting out with 23 questions. And you could do 0 of the rest of the test and you would earn a 134 with those 23 questions, but you have 2 more scored sections to play with. On those scored logical reasoning and reading comprehension questions, you need to make up 43 extra questions. Now, to get those 43 extra questions, That means you have to answer about 83% of the questions on those sections correctly in order to get your target score of 170. Now let's compare that to what you would have to get on a test without logic games. If there were only reading comprehension and logical reasoning sections, then you'd have to get 88% of those questions correct. So essentially that logic game section, just acing that logic game section is giving you a 5% boost on the test. And that might not seem like a lot, but on a test of about 75 questions, it's going to translate to 3 or 4 questions that you can miss as a result of that perfect LG score. And those 3 to 4 questions come in really, really handy because the LSAT is really a game of margins. We have to move quickly. We have to skip some questions potentially. There's some questions that we kind of have to guess on. So having an extra 3 or 4 questions to play with can really make the difference and make it a bit easier to get one of your top scores. So another reason why you might want to think about taking the test with logic games, it's the common pathway. It gives us a common pathway to one of the top scores. Another way that this can benefit you, though, is psychological. If you are crushing a logic game section, you can really know that you're crushing it. If you get to a point where you know you can get perfect or near perfect scores on a logic game section, you'll know on the real test that you're in the process of getting a perfect or near perfect logic game score. It doesn't quite work that clearly for the other 2 sections. Like, yeah, there'll be a lot of logical reasoning questions and reading comp questions that you know you're getting correct. But there's some where you're like, 80% sure, 90% sure, sometimes as little as like 70% sure that you're getting it correct. You don't have that built-in certainty that you have with the logic game section. So in a test with logic games, you can kind of know like that you crushed that section. And that kind of builds confidence on the LSAT. And confidence is a really, really great resource on the test. Confidence can prevent us from doing silly things on the test, like abandoning our strategies that we've been practicing for months to prepare for the test. Prevents us from doing silly things like second guessing ourselves or talking ourselves into the wrong answer. Those things really are products of our anxieties on the exam. And if we have confidence built in from that logic game section, we can at least minimize those anxieties or deal with those anxieties and prevent, to a certain extent, those anxieties from lowering our scores. So there's also this kind of psychological benefit that we can derive from doing really well on the logic game section. Last reason to think about taking the LSAT before August 2024 is that the logic games section can make the test less exhausting for us. That's because the other 2 sections, reading comp and logical reasoning, very wordy. They have about 4,500 words each. So if you do 4 of those sections on your test, because remember, the post-August 2024 test is going to have 3 scored logical reasoning and reading comp sections and 1 unscored experimental section, which will be either a logical reasoning or reading comp section. Doing 4 of those is like reading a novella and answering a bunch of questions about that novella in about 2.5 hours. That's a lot to read. And we're doing the same skill over and over again. When we're exercising that same muscle over and over again, we can get fatigued. And so if we get fatigued, we start making mistakes, start doing silly things like misreading things or misinterpreting things or not moving as fast, as quickly through the sections as we'd like. And that can, in some instances, decrease our overall score. And that's not great. And we've heard from test takers who are preparing to take the LSAT without logic games, but have previously taken the LSAT with logic games. They do feel a little bit more fatigued and less sharp during the last section of their logic games lists LSAT. So that's another thing to consider. Maybe the logic game section will prevent us from making us fatigued at the end of the test because it kind of switches things up. It de-emphasizes the reading, emphasizes more of these kind of drawing visual skills. And so it serves as a nice respite in the middle of the exam. I've got a few questions that I'm going to answer before we move on to reasons to take the LSAT without logic games. Uh, First one, Lena asks if I recommend taking the LSAT with or without logic games, and that's kind of what we're discussing right now. So hopefully this is giving you some information to use. Next is from Christine. Uh, that's not really a question, that's a comment. We have Christian, though, who asked what order the sections are tested in. So there's no set order to how these sections are tested. It changes from test to test. It changes from test taker to test taker. So we can't guarantee what order you'll get your sections in. So the best way to prepare for that is take a lot of practice tests that will vary the order of the sections. So you get a little bit of experience with any potential section order that you might have. All right, so we've got those questions answered. We're now going to switch gears a little bit and talk about reasons to take the LSAT in or after August 2024. So in other words, take the LSAT without logic games. So obviously, if you don't have a STEM major, if you don't feel like you have those skills built in from your academic or work experience, then those reasons to take the test with the logic games are probably not very compelling to you. You're not a puzzle person. Likewise, those reasons to take the test with logic games probably weren't very compelling to you. If you're not aiming for a top score, or you don't think you'll get exhausted by reading all that information in a logic game, or sorry, logical reasoning or reading comprehension section, probably not a great reason to take the test with logic games. So if none of those things apply to you, then you might want to give yourself a little bit more time to study by choosing to take the test in August or later. The biggest reason, I think, to wait to take the LSAT in August or later is really a practical one. It's really about how many points you're trying to increase your score on the LSAT. If you're trying to increase your score from when you're starting to what your final score will be by more than 20 points, it probably makes sense to just wait for the August 2024 LSAT. So when you begin your LSAT studies, first thing you want to do is establish your starting LSAT score. So you just want to take a practice test under timed test-like conditions. LSATMax has a free version of it on the free version of our course that'll allow you to do that. You're going to get a score back. Probably not going to be super happy with that score. Almost nobody is. And that score is just your starting point. It in no way determines or limits what your final score will be. But by subtracting that score from your target LSAT score, that will tell you what score increase you're attempting to make. And by the way, if you're unsure what your target score might be, just look into some schools that you want to apply to. They all post their incoming classes median LSAT scores. Typically, they post 3 medians: 25th percentile median, a 50th percentile median, and a 75th percentile median. And typically, we're just aiming for a score somewhere between those two, between the 25th and the 50th percentile median. So it'll tell us what our target score should be to make us a competitive applicant at that school. Now, if you want to make a little bit more specific of a plan, also take a look at their GPAs and ask yourself how your GPA compares to the 3 median GPAs they're posting for their incoming class. Again, there's a 25th, 50th, and 75th percentile median. And you can kind of use where your GPA exists in between those medians to determine what your target LSAT score should be. For instance, if your GPA is somewhere in between the 25th and 50th percentile median, you can counterbalance that with a slightly higher LSAT score. In that case, you might want to aim for a target score somewhere in between the 50th and 75th percentile median to kind of counterbalance that GPA that's beneath the 50th percentile GPA. Even if your GPA is beneath the 25th percentile GPA, you can still get into that law school. You can still be a competitive applicant. You just might need to further counterbalance that with an even higher target LSAT score, an LSAT score that's above the 75th percentile median. So that can give you a sense of what your target score should be. And once you have your target score and that first diagnostic test score that you took, you're going to know your score increase that you're trying to get. And if that score increase is above 20 points, so if you're trying to move from like a 150 to a 171, if you're trying to move from like a 144 to a 168, it's going to be very difficult to increase your score by that much by June of 2024. It's not impossible. We've seen massive increases very quickly, but to increase your score by that much, it does take a little bit longer than the 4 months we have before the June test. And also, if we're planning on taking that June test, we're engaging with a little bit of risk. If that June test doesn't work out, if we don't get our target score on that June exam, all that time we spent studying logic games was effectively wasted. Because we can take the LSAT again, but if we choose to take the LSAT in August or later, now we're taking a version of the test without logic games. So we spent so much time learning logic games for the June 2024 test. Now we have to take it again. All that knowledge we acquired about logic games no longer matters. So wouldn't it just been better from the very beginning to just focus on 2 sections, just worry about logical reasoning and reading comprehension, and focus on improving your skills on those enough to prepare for the August test? To me, that seems like a little bit better plan. You have to at least be really confident you're going to ace logic games in order to build your plan of increasing your score by 20 or more points by June. So those are the factors I think we should all consider when deciding which type of LSAT we should take this year. Now, what I want to talk about is how we can prepare for each type of exam. So first, I'm going to talk about a few tips that I've gathered through the years on how to ace the logic game section. So we're not going to dive in and get real specific with like specific strategies on how to do the different types of games. We'll talk more broad strokes here, really themes or principles or rules I'd like you to follow to do well on the logic game section. The first kind of rule I'd like you to follow, before we get into those rules, just want to clarify, most people are going to start out learning logic games and feel like they are extremely difficult. However, logic games' difficulty is really a product of their novelty. Most of us have never tried a logic game before we started an LSAT. It's actually kind of weird to do a logic game before you started studying for the LSAT. So you look at these logic games, these things about ordering courses or putting people into booths at a fair. You're like, what are these? How do I approach these? These things seem really hard. But their difficulty is a product of their novelty. Once they become less novel, they're definitely something that most people will find learnable. So I want us to start off with this idea that logic games are extremely learnable. They're difficult at first, but we can learn to conquer them. We just have to know what we're doing on them. First thing we have to know is, what are the broad skills that they're testing? So at LSATMax, we like to say that the LSAT itself, all 3 sections, really are only testing 3 different skills: reading, analyzing, and connecting. Those are the 3 big things we have to do on the LSAT. If we can learn to read, analyze, and connect in the way the test wants us to, then we're going to get a very good score on the LSAT. Now, the logic game section in particular focuses on analyzing and connecting. Those are the 2 skills that it emphasizes. Obviously, reading is a bigger part of reading comprehension and logic games. In terms of analyzing, that's just a fancy way of saying thinking. Looking at the information presented and thinking about it and making decisions based on our thoughts. So we're going to get the game, we're going to get a little hypothetical situation described. We're going to have to analyze what type of game are we playing. Is it more of the ordering horses in a race type of game, or is it more of the putting volunteers in a booth type of a game? We're also going to have to analyze how to represent the rules. They're going to give us a series of rules about how those horses can be ordered, how those people can be stuffed into the groups. We're going to have to think about how we can represent them on our scratch paper. We have to analyze spatial relationships. Oh, if we put these variables over here, where can these other variables go? And we're going to have to analyze how to work through the questions efficiently. Given unlimited time, like anyone could get a perfect score on the logic game section. The problem is on the LSAT, we very much have the opposite of unlimited time. Our time is very limited indeed. So we need to think about how we can get through those questions efficiently. So we're not taking forever just to answer a given question. We also have to think about connecting, how we can connect multiple rules. Okay, if this rule says these things about these variables, and this other rule says these other things about those same variables, which of those two rules together tell us about those variables? How can we connect those rules together? And we need to connect, okay, how do these rules actually affect the variables? I have these three rules about these groups. How is that going to limit the number of variables that can go into those groups? We also need to connect how one question can help us on other questions. Hey, you're doing the logic game section. You did a question where you figured out that horse J can go in spot 3. And you're doing another question that says which of the following could be true. Well, one of the correct answers could say horse J could be in spot 3. It's kind of connecting those two questions together. It's like, oh, if I figured out this question, I now have the answer to this question. So these are the broad skills that we're being asked to apply on the logic game section. Now, in order to learn these skills efficiently and make sure they're developed well enough to ace that logic game section, kind of thought of 3 principles or 3 rules that you can follow as you take the logic game section, you prepare for the logic game section. First rule, when in doubt, write it out. Try to make all these rules like kind of like rhymey or alliterative to make them more memorable. So when in doubt, write it out. Remember why the logic game section is going away. Because scratch paper presented such an advantage on this game that it's unfair to people who can't use the scratch paper. Yeah, that scratch paper is so advantageous. We should make liberal use of it. We need to take advantage of that. Most people really err when they're doing logic games when they try to do all the work of these games in their head. But this work is really too complicated for most of us to handle all this information in our head. We're much faster at thinking with our pencils. If we ever get stuck, if we ever need to think about how 2 rules might apply to each other, if we ever need to think about whether a certain variable can go in a certain spot, it's going to be faster for us to represent that on our scratch paper. So if we're unsure, or if we get stuck, putting pencil to paper can solve the problem for us. So that's something we're going to need to do when we're practicing logic games. That's something we're going to need to do when we're taking practice tests with the logic game section. That's certainly something we're going to need to do on the real test. Remember that when in doubt, write it out. Second principle I want us all to follow. Front load at first. Front load at first. Now, what does that mean? Well, I'm going to have to give you a little bit of philosophy behind the logic game section, especially teaching the logic game section, in order for us to make sense of this rule. Now, with LSAT nerds like me, people who took the LSAT, loved the LSAT, teach the LSAT, there is kind of a debate, a hotly contested debate on how to best do logic games. Do you front load your work on logic games, or do you backload your work on logic games? And most people who teach the LSAT kind of come down on one of these 2 philosophies, front loading versus backloading. Now, by front loading, that refers to figuring out as much of the game as you can before you start the questions. So before you answer a single question, You're looking at the game, you're analyzing the game, you're drawing out the connections you have with that game. So that means you're spending more time up front connecting the rules, drawing out scenarios or hypotheticals about the various limited ways that the game can play out, and making additional rules that we call deductions. Like, hey, this is what the game tells us. These are what the rules tell us. But I know if I think about it for a little bit, if I draw a few things out, if I make a few connections, there's a whole class of other rules, additional rules, hidden rules called deductions that are going to make answering the questions easier. So the front loading philosophy is all about we're going to invest our time at the beginning of the game, get a really, really strong understanding of the game, have a lot of answers anticipated by the things we draw out on our scratch paper. And that's just going to make it way easier and way faster to answer the questions. That's one philosophy. The other philosophy is backloading. Now, the backloading philosophy would say that, a lot of the time you spend front loading at the beginning of the game, you can actually do as you answer the questions. So rather than spend a bunch of time up front doing all of these things, we can wait to do that on the questions. So instead of investing our time up front, we'll save that time so we can spend more of it as we answer the questions to analyze the best way to answer the questions. Does it make the most sense to answer those questions in order? Or can we find some advantage, some hidden advantage by taking those questions out of order? Doing certain kinds of questions first and saving other kinds of questions last. In the backloading philosophy, you're also saving more time to test various answer choices. To go, I don't know the answer to this question, but I know I can pick a few answer choices and test them out to see what the answer might be. And in the backloading approach, you're spending more time as you answer the questions, referencing prior work. Okay, I did this work on the previous question, and I'm going to refer to that to give me a little head start on the next few questions. So those are the kind of two philosophies of approaching logic games, front loading and back loading. And as someone who's been able to work with a lot of students and observe a lot of talented, very smart instructors, I can assure you that both approaches work. Both approaches can get you a great score on the LSAT. It's not that one is inherently better than the other, although a lot of instructors say that. Most of the instructors think that the approach that worked for them will work for everyone. That's not necessarily true. It's more about finding which of these two approaches works more for you. However, with that said, the front loading approach is harder at first. It's going to come less naturally to you than the backloading approach. Because the front loading approach involves really thinking about the game, working through the game, drawing out possibilities in that game that you maybe would not consider normally in order for you to get that head start on the questions. It's a harder strategy to master at first. Because it's harder, we need to work harder to do it at first. Because it comes naturally to us, we need to make a conscious effort to attempt it first. Because if we left you out and just said, hey, figure out the games on your own, most of us are going to default to that backloading approach. That's the approach that's going to come more naturally to us. And that's the approach that might be better for you ultimately. But if you never try the front loading approach, you're not going to know which approach is better for you as an individual test taker. So what I recommend is starting the front load approach at first, forcing yourself in the early stages of your studies when you're not worried about how long it's taking you to do these games. You're not worried about how many of the questions you're getting correct because you're not doing a real practice test or the real test. Try out the front loading approach. Give it an honest try. Because it's the harder one to master, it's important to try it at first. Give yourself the requisite time to learn it and see if it's right for you. Additionally, the front-loading approach, in my experience, is generally more effective. For most games, if you front load your work effectively, it's going to allow you to work through the questions more quickly, have to write down fewer things as you work through those questions, and make your work through the questions a little bit less error prone. So for most people, front loading is the better approach. It's another reason we're going to start with it. We want to start with the one that's just a little bit, for most people, more effective. So we're going to start with the front loading approach, give it a good try, see if it works for us. And then if it doesn't, we can default for the backloading approach. The front loading approach is especially valuable on the most complex games. And games only get more complex over time. So unfortunately, those of us who are taking the LSAT in August or June are going to get like the most complex games ever, potentially. The front loading approach is the one we want to at least try out to see if it's right for us, because it's generally more effective on these very complex games. It's a lot better than doing the backloading approach first. Really less strategy with the backloading approach, less things you have to learn. It's just more about, like, in a lot of ways, doing just some grunt work through the game, doing some busy work through the game. So there's less strategy, less to learn. So it's easy to pick up at the end of your studies. Like, oh, I've tried the front loading approach. I really tried it. Doesn't work for me. It's okay. I have some time for the backloading approach to implement that, see if that works better. Probably will. However, if you did it in reverse, if you tried the backloading approach, you consistently found that you couldn't get all the questions correct, if you had trouble finishing games in the amount of time you're given, it's going to be really hard to institute that front loading approach at the end of the studies. You're trying to switch over to a front loading approach and you only have like a month before your exam. That's not going to be a lot of time to do that, unfortunately. So recommend starting with the front loading approach, practicing that skill. Practicing that skill will improve your understanding of how logic games work in general, allow you to determine if it's the right approach for you, teach you about your game solving preferences. Like, okay, this front loading thing's really working for me. I've been trying it for months, hasn't clicked. Maybe it's time to make a switch. And if you do decide to make that switch, actually all that practice you got with the front loading approach is going to help you with the backloading approach, because you figured out how to do various connections of rules and different types of hypotheticals and different types of deductions on the front loading approach. You'll just be doing those same things on the questions as opposed to before the questions. So the work you do preparing for the front loading approach will help you on the backloading approach. And like I mentioned, start with the backloading approach. Only practicing that can prevent you from developing more efficient ways to solve games, i.e. through the front loading approach, learning whether the front loading approach is a better approach for you, or having enough time to practice a front loading approach later. So second principle I want us to follow is front load at first. Practice it at first. See if it's right for you. For most people it is, but at least if it isn't, it won't take you quite as long to learn the backloading approach. Third and final tip. Scenarios are the way to go. This is, couldn't figure out a way to make this rhyme and make it memorable, but that's what we went with. So what do I mean by scenarios? Well, this is a strategy to help us front load more effectively. When we front load on a logic game, we need to figure out how the rules connect and limit the possible outcomes for the game. That's what front loading really does. It allows us to figure out how limited the possible outcomes are for the game so that we know the answers to any of the questions they might ask us. That's essentially what the questions ask about on logic games, about the limited possible outcomes for that game. Most of us, though, have trouble imagining how the rules connect, like seeing in our mind's eye how the rules interact and affect the variables. That kind of goes back to tip one, right? When in doubt, write it out. We're better at thinking with our pencils than our brains on logic games. So scenarios are going to allow us to think through the game with a visual reference point. So what do I mean when I say scenarios? Well, scenarios are going to involve using one or two built-in constraints in the game to map out all of the possible ways that the game can play out. So before we do a single question, we're figuring out all of the possible outcomes for the game, or almost all of the outcomes for the game. But obviously, we can't spend hours and hours mapping out every individual outcome. So there's going to be a few open-ended things where we take a few built-in constraints, see how the game applies those constraints, and we have a lot of bases covered for the number of ways that the game can play out. And then we're going to use those scenarios to give us a head start on all of the questions. So to show you how this might play out, remember that ordering horses thing we talked about earlier, where we had J, G, and M in 2, 3, and 5, respectively. We also had a rule that said horse H had to finish 3 spaces ahead of horse T. And we said, hey, when we engage our spatial reasoning on this, there's only 2 places where that HT block can go. It can go in either 1 and 4, or it can go in 4 and 7. Well, that constraint, the fact that the HT block can only go in 2 places, will be the basis of our scenarios. We would draw out one setup that looks just like this, but it has H in 1 and T in 4 to represent the fact that one possible outcome for the game has H in 1 and T in 4. And then we would draw out another little game board like this, but this one is going to have H in 4 and T in 7 to represent the second possible outcome for the game, which is that H is in 4 and T is in 7. And having those 2 game boards on our scratch paper is going to allow us to work through the questions much more efficiently. Because no matter what the question asks about, it's going to have to exist in one of those 2 exclusive outcomes for the game. One with the HT block in 1 and 4, and one with the HT block in 4 and 7. So that's going to give us a head start and a visual reference point to use on every single question. That will make the questions easier, will make it take less time to answer them. And that, in my opinion, is really the most effective way to front load our work. So when we're talking about learning how to front load, really what we're talking about is learning how to make good scenarios. And why do those scenarios work? Well, they allow you to apply the rules to develop a better understanding of the game. We're taking that rule that H and T have to be configured in this way, and we're putting it into our game board so we can actually see how that rule affects the game. And by doing that, we have at least part of the answer to any question they could conceivably ask. We know if they ask a question, the answer to that question is going to need to have either H in 1 or 4. Part of that answer is going to need to have either T in 4 or 7. And knowing that information, again, will give us confidence, that precious resource on the LSAT as we work through the questions. So how are we going to make those scenarios? Well, for an in-depth discussion on this, you can go to our YouTube page. I have a webinar called A More Enlightened Way to Do Logic Games, or More Enlightened Approach to Logic Games. You can search for that. You will get a lot of tips on how to do scenarios. If you want even more in-depth of a discussion, we have many, many live classes on this topic where our instructors can teach you and show you how to make scenarios. But broadly speaking, what you want to do is identify a scenario queue. A scenario queue is just a constraint in the game, like this HT block, that limits how many ways the game can play out. So we have this little HT block. We figured out it can only go in 2 places. That's a scenario queue to play out the 2 different ways that that HT block can be placed. We want to make sure that scenario queue has 2 elements. We want to make sure it's constrained. And there's only very few ways that that scenario queue can be incorporated into our game board. So like only 2 places where it can place that block. Another scenario queue might be a very limited slot on our game board. Maybe only like 2 or 3 variables can go in a given slot. That would be another way to make a set of scenarios. Maybe another way is a very limited variable. Maybe a given variable can only go in like 2 or 3 places. So we play out the 2 or 3 scenarios where based on the different places we can put that variable. So we want to make sure it's constrained to like 2 or 3 or 4 different places. We also want to make sure that that scenario Q is influential, that it's going to affect many variables or places in our setup, because that's ultimately what we want to get out of these scenarios, extra information. Well, if I place H and T here, that's going to tell me about some other variables. It's going to limit the places that the other horses can go in our setup. So that is 3 principles we can follow to ace the logic game section. The three things I want you all to remember as you practice the logic game section. Now, what I want to talk about right now is the tools that will be available to you to study for a test without logic games. There's a few things we want to do that we want to make sure we have for taking the exam in August 2024 or later. First of all, we don't want to do any logic games. We don't want to waste time with any logic games lesson. So fortunately, if you study with LSATMax, taking out logic games is just a matter of clicking a button. You can, if you set your course date to August 2024 or later, we'll automatically take out all the logic games lessons and give you only the reading comp and logical reasoning lessons. However, another way you can do it is by going to your profile and clicking that you want to disable logic games. And by disabling logic games, again, we're going to take away all of the logic games lessons. So you're not wasting any time studying those. You only have the reading comp and logical reasoning lessons. But if you decide to switch back at any point, you decide to take the exam before August 2024, and you're like, oh, shoot, I need to learn logic games. That's okay. You can just go back to your profile, click that you don't want to disable logic games. You want to repopulate your lesson plan with logic games, and they come all in. We can see a few logic games lessons there, like intro to games, sequencing games, etc. So really just a touch of the button. We're going to specify the course to the exam you're taking. But of course, you also want to make sure that your practice exams, when you start taking those, are going to mimic the actual practice exam, or sorry, the actual exam you'll take. So we've gone back through all of the 95 practice exams on our interface, and we've retrofitted them so that they mimic the post-August 2024 version of the test, where there are 2 scored logical reasoning sections, 1 reading comp section, and 1 experimental section. That's either a 3rd logical reasoning section or a 2nd reading comp section. So that way, when you take practice exams, you'll get the experience of taking those very wordy exams and having a scoring system that's going to be updated to actually predict your final score. One thing I also want to emphasize is that we're not stopping there. We're going to continue to produce more lessons and resources for you, especially now that logic games is more important than ever. Now, I think what I don't want the message to be is if you study with LSATMax for the post-August 2024 LSAT, there's just going to be a subtracted version of the current test. Or sorry, just a subtracted version of our current course. It's not the case at all. We're going to be expanding our resources on logical reasoning and reading comprehension. And we're going to continue to host free daily live classes with our expert instructors where we cover those 2 sections from every possible angle. We're not subtracting in anticipation of the changing LSAT. We're going to continue to add content. That's a big part of my job, and it's something I'm really excited to do, to dig even deeper into logical reasoning and reading comprehension to make sure our students are more prepared for those 2 sections than ever. And that is what we're going to be doing in our course. Now, we're going to get to an open Q&A section of this. Finished a little over an hour, a little more than I promised. Apologies for that, but we will get to your questions very, very soon. This is the part of the webinar where I have to tell you about all of the great things about LSATMax and all of the courses that we have offered for you, and also talk a little bit about the discount we'll be giving you as part of your attendance of this webinar. Now, I've pitched LSATMax in a variety of ways and talked about a lot of things we offer in this webinar. But really what I want you all to do, if you're interested in studying with LSATMax, is reach out to us. Sign up for a free account. Talk to some of our student representatives. Talk to some of my colleagues in the customer support team. Might even be able to talk to Rinehart, founder and CEO of LSATMax. You can also talk to me. We are all extremely available to our students. That's because at LSATMax, our philosophy really is that we want to take your success as seriously as you take your success. And I think if you find that you reach out to us and talk to us and work with us, develop a customized study plan, work with us to answer some of the questions you have about the LSAT or law school admissions, you're going to find that we're genuine people. You're going to find that we really genuinely care about your success. You're going to find that we are going to put more effort into helping you out. And I'm willing to bet that we do that a lot better than our competitors. As I've said, I've worked for a number of LSAT prep companies, and I know at LSATMax, we take our student success more seriously than I've seen elsewhere. So I just want to ask you to do that. If you're interested in studying with LSATMax, reach out to us, talk to us. You're going to find that we are in the helping you business, because that's ultimately what we care about the most. You're also curious about what studying with LSATMax would look like, what our resources look like. Open up a free account with us. No payment. We don't ask for any information from you other than your email to build that account. You have a free account, and I think you're going to find even with that free account, we offer a lot of resources to you, a lot of things that can help your success. And if you like what you see on that free account, we have a number of cost-effective ways to study for the LSAT. We have more affordable options like our self-study program, which is just going to give you the prep tests and the explanations and let you figure out the LSAT with those two resources. It's offered at just $49.99 a month, but you would get a 20% discount if you wanted to build that quarterly as opposed to monthly. We also have the on-demand program starting at $149 a month. That gives you all the explanations, all of the prep tests, but also our award-winning course that breaks down the LSAT in a very understandable, intuitive way, giving you the strategies for all of the sections that you'll be taking on your exam, whether you're taking it with or without logic games. You can also get through that our daily live courses where our instructors all teach the LSAT from every different angle, kind of supplement the course lesson videos with daily live classes where you can ask instructors questions, where you can learn working live with an instructor, or go back through our library of over 1,000 hours of live video classes. Or you can choose to go with the live plus tutoring option. That's where you get the award-winning course, all the tests, the live classes, the explanation, and you also get time to work with a tutor. Work one-on-one with one of our expert tutors who've all scored in the 99th percentile of the LSAT, who have all been mentored by me so that they have some of the lessons of my experience and the resources that I've created for them so that you can really dial down on what you need to learn to do great on the LSAT and hit your target score. So again, start that free course. Reach out to some of our customer service representatives, me, Ron, we have others you can talk to, and you'll find, I think, that you will have your back. Here's some student testimonials. We also have more in-depth